Good morning. We're here today on Sunshine and Transparency with the Honorable David Walker. We're very honored to have you as a guest, sir.
Good to be with you, Tony.
Good to see you. Good to see you. I want to get right into it. I do want to have some announcements for our listeners later, but I want to get right into it with where we ended last week with the Catholic theologian Ted Flynn, author of 9 books, graduate of London School of Economics, right where we ended with him. And I want to read something to you to get your reaction, Dave. And it's something that Alexander Tytler said, the Scottish historian. And this is where Ted ended last week. And he said, from bondage to spirit, the cycle that humanity goes through in almost every empire is the following: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, and from selfishness to apathy, and from apathy back to dependence once again, and from dependence back to bondage. Now, that he also, now this was ascribed actually to an ancient Greek philosopher, but Tytler also said it, that a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It only exists until a majority of voters discover that they can vote themselves largest out of the public treasury. Now, that those thoughts have been around for hundreds of years. They've been repeated by others. Ben Franklin said something very similar about democracy. And I just want to get your general comments and feelings about that, about the.
Of course, I think those are timeless words. As a practicing Roman Catholic, I'm familiar with them. As a student of history, I'm familiar with them as well. And as you probably know, Tony, my latest book, which is called America in 2040, Still a Superpower, question mark. One of the things about that book is it tries to help people understand lessons from history, lessons from others, and what are the things that we need to do in order to be able to make sure that our future is better than our past. And in that regard, real quick, talking about history, we're not an empire. All right. We don't seek to be an empire, but we are a superpower. And what do I mean by superpower? Global economic power, global diplomatic influence, global military capabilities, and global cultural influence. There have been other countries and civilizations in the past that have been superpowers. Arguably, the greatest one was the Roman Empire. As you know, it lasted about 500 years as a republic, and then the republic fell, and then it became an autocracy. We don't want that to happen with us, but it's happened throughout history. But the Roman Empire ultimately fell for several reasons. Number one, fiscal irresponsibility. Number two, political incivility. Number three, moral decline. Number four, inability to control its borders. Uh, and do those and overextended military. Number five, overextended military. Do those sound familiar? So the key point is we need to learn from history. We need to learn from others. We need to take steps to help make sure that we're not just living for today, but we're taking steps to be able to create a better tomorrow. And on the path that we're on right now, we're not taking the steps necessary to create a better tomorrow.
No, it doesn't seem we are, Dave. Now, Dave's book, America in 2040, is an excellent read. I've read it. It should be read by every decision maker in government, every political type, every bureaucrat that has a hand out there. It is dense with facts, and I want to get right to it. We do recommend it. Is on Amazon under the Honorable David M. Walker. You can Google it and buy it and read it yourselves, because we are even though the book was written 4 years ago and updated, we're facing every issue in it is alive today. And now with the new administration coming in, it's a critical time to try to navigate our way out of this huge amount of debt.
Oh,
One
Tony, can I mention one thing real quick? The quick way for people to check it out is to go to americain2040.com. That not only has information about the book, it has a number of opinion pieces that I've written and videos and things of that nature. So americain2040.com. And people who read it, as you know, it's very prophetic. I mean, I predicted 4 years ago the rise of the alliance against U.S. interests led by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, who are aligning against our interests in all those dimensions that I mentioned before, economically, diplomatically, militarily, and culturally, as well as the fact that Russia was likely to invade Ukraine, which they did, and tragically. So, but you're right. We now are in a situation where we need to make major transformational changes, not nip and tuck. We need reconstructive surgery, and
You're
hopefully
talking
we'll get.
about structural change.
Yes, correct. That's
And
correct.
that's the BRICS. I have one thing to say about it. They just had a meeting, added six more members. They now total in gross domestic product a larger number than NATO. And that's the first time in history. But I want to throw a question at you. Who is our greatest adversary? Is it the BRICS or is it ourselves?
We'll never be defeated from the outside. To the extent that we have, a serious challenge, it's going to be from the inside. I've said, and it's been echoed by a number of military leaders, such as the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, as well as the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Bill Owens, that the greatest threat to our future is our own fiscal irresponsibility. If you can't put your financial house in order, you will lose economic power. You will therefore lose diplomatic influence. You will therefore lose military capability, and people will not want to emulate you from a cultural standpoint in the future. So, unlike the environmental sustainability challenge, which is real, okay, although we've got to be more realistic about how do you balance energy needs and the transition to alternative fuels, we also have to recognize that we can't solve that problem by ourselves. If every other major country doesn't participate, you won't solve the problem. And right now they're not. That unlike the environmental sustainability challenge, the fiscal sustainability challenge is as big or bigger, and we are the only ones that can solve it. Nobody else can because nobody's going to bail out America.
Now, we only have an hour with Dave today. He's very busy, and I want to get right into the book. One thing I'd like you to take a minute on and explain to people, because I think there's a general misconception about state finances. Of course, the United States has 50 states, and they don't have the ability to print their own money. So in your mind, you sort of think, well, they have to balance it out at the end of the year. They can't spend more than they take in. And that's not the case. And I note in your book that you cite almost 40 states that per person are in negative dollars. That's per person in the state. And they jump all the way up to 60,000 negative per person in the state. And I'd like you to explain how that world has evolved, if you would, for a minute, Dave.
Well, 49 out of 50 states have some requirement for a quote unquote balanced budget. But the real key is, how do you define a balanced budget? Most states have two kinds of budgets. They have a capital budget, which is investment oriented, and they have an operating budget. So the first way that they define it is they're just talking about the operating budget. Secondly, most states define it as you have to balance cash flows, cash in, cash out. Well, let me tell you the games that they play on that. Number one, they can not make contributions to the pension fund, which saves cash now but increases the unfunded liability. They cannot fund their retiree health plans. They fund it on a pay-as-you-go basis, which again significantly increases the unfunded liabilities. They go out and they issue revenue anticipation bonds. They take the cash from the revenue anticipation bonds, which is debt. They take that and they count that as revenue. And so the bottom line is that when you look at the federal, state, and local government, the number one challenge is unfunded retirement obligations, whether they be pensions or retiree health care. And therefore, you've got a number of states that while they say they balance their budget, they're in terrible financial condition. And as you know, Tony, the states can't declare bankruptcy. Cities can, municipalities can, but states can't, which means that they're going to have to solve their own problem. And one of the reasons that I left Connecticut, my wife and I did, but it's a beautiful state with a proud history and a great geographic location, great people there, great quality of life, but it's incredibly expensive. It's not competitive, and it's in terrible financial condition. It's gone from top three to bottom three in financial condition and competitive posture. And being able to read financial statements, I knew it was only going to get worse over time, absent a major transformational change. And by the way, the same thing exists for the federal government. And the federal government can't declare bankruptcy either. And by the way, we can't default on our debt because the only thing that is now guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States that is a financial matter is U.S. debt and accrued interest. Nothing else is guaranteed, but that is.
That's unbelievable. Just unbelievable. The thought that the states. I want to throw a quote out to you, and I want you to comment on it in that context, specifically of state pension plans. FDR said uh, he was 100% in support of unions. He was a great supporter of unions, but he said there will be no union in my government. My government employees will work for the people. They will have no second boss. Now, I want you to comment on that and maybe veer over to a point in your book where you're talking about the education system, if you would.
Well, first,
It's public school, sir, from
yeah,
uh,
yeah. Well,
K through 12.
first, with regard to unions, the federal government did not have a unionized workforce. That changed under JFK, John F. Kennedy. He allowed for unionization at the federal level. Ironically, while the unionized workforce in the United States has declined dramatically in the last several decades, the one area where it has not declined and the area where there's the largest percentage of unionized workers is government. By the way, when you look at the unemployment statistics and job growth, you'll find that the most rapid job growth is in government, which is a troubling signal because government's grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, lost control of the budget, and has not managed for results. So that's got to change. With regard to education, a lot of people think that since we're arguably the greatest superpower on earth at the present time, that we must be number one in about everything. Well, we are number one in a number of things, including the size of our economy and our military capabilities, but we're not number one in everything. And in fact, there are a number of areas where actually we are below average. And one of those areas is despite the fact that we spend so much more money per pupil on average on K through 12 education, we have below average results. We're not top 25 in math or science. We don't teach financial literacy or civic responsibility in all of our high schools before people can graduate from high school. And so as a result, we're spending a lot of money, but we're not getting the results. Another example of that, which we may touch on later, is healthcare. We spend way more money and we get below average results. And the reason I think is several things. You have to have three things in place in order to achieve sustainable success. Number one, you have to have properly designed incentives that encourage people to do the right thing and discourage them from doing the wrong thing. Number two, you have to have adequate transparency in the case of what we're talking about here, cost and quality as it relates to healthcare, in order to provide reasonable assurance we'll do the right thing and to be able to provide some check and balance. And thirdly, you've got to have appropriate accountability if people do the wrong thing. In the case of K through 12 education, healthcare, and a number of other systems, we're 0 for 3. In baseball, that's called a strikeout.
Oh my gosh. Now, one thing I want to point out in Graham, Eklund, and Early's book, The Myth of American Inequality, they have a recent study issued by National Assessment of Education, which administers tests to K through 12. And this is actually, I think, even more recent. They said only 25% of high school seniors are math proficient and 33% are reading proficient. And they said actually, if you measured it during high school, the numbers decline so that a freshman would be scoring higher than 25% in math. By the time he were a senior, he'd be down to 25% in math. And the costs, as you've outlined in your book, are somewhere around 380% above inflation. Now, that's almost hard to believe because when you're back in the 1950s, 1960s, we were peerless in education, but you're telling me that we're spending 400% the amount today in getting one-fourth the result.
Well, the key is that we have the best or among the best, uh, you know, post K through 12 education systems in the country. Our colleges and universities are the gold standard, if you will. But on the other hand, as we've said, our while we spend a lot of money on K through 12, we get below average results. That's just unacceptable. Um, we need dramatic transformational reform there. But as you know, education is primarily done at the state and local level, not at the federal level. So there are things that the federal government can do to try to help facilitate that transformational change, but most of the effort is going to have to be done at the state and local level. And we need to do it sooner rather than later. Another related point is the United States doesn't have a human capital strategy. What do I mean by that? I mean, what do we need to do to attract, retain, motivate, engage people to maintain competitive growth, to maximize opportunity, to be able to make sure that we're not only doing well domestically, but we're doing well as compared to our peers? Because you don't know how well you're doing unless you compare it to your peers or your competitors or your comparators, if you will. And that's why that's an important dimension that we need to focus on to a greater extent than we have historically. Um, and that's why we have a false sense of security in a number of areas because we're not comparing it to who we're competing with. And in today's world, we're engaged in a global economic Olympics. And there is competition not only for resources, there's competition for human capital. So we need to look at our education system, our immigration system, our training and retraining system, our welfare system, and a variety of other things to come up with an integrated, comprehensive strategy to maximize the value of our human capital, to enhance our competitive posture, and to improve opportunity for Americans.
Now, what Dave means by that is we need to invest in our youth. We need to. I mean, it's a beautiful. Now, I'm a Trump supporter, but I'm going to say something. We're not about just building Trump Towers and Taj Mahals. We need to take money and invest it in our youth in a way that's productive. It's not enough just to throw money at it and end up with poor results. It has to be a merit-based type investment where we reward progress. We need to get back to that. I think that's the best way of saying a
Well,
capital investment in youth, right?
well, that's a clear an element of it. There's no question. I mean, one of the things, if you look broader, Tony, the federal government's been in existence since 1789, and we still don't have a comprehensive government-wide, results-oriented, and resource-constrained strategic plan. We're flying blind in mountains of debt without any instrument panel. And so one of the things that has to happen is the new administration is going to have to help facilitate creating such a plan and adapting key national indicators that are outcome based that we can say, okay, here's what the role of the government is. Here's the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Let's put together a set of metrics to be able to understand whether or not we're making progress. How do we compare to others? Uh, that's important not just for the executive branch, because in many cases, we're not managing for results. We're
So we
just doing more things and spending more money. But it's also important for the legislative branch with regard to any new legislation, with regard to a reauthorization, with regard to oversight, and with regard to appropriations. These are management 101 principles which the federal government has yet to adopt. I realize you don't want to rush into things, but I would say since 1789, we should have been doing this a long time ago.
would you say it's fair to say that we've drifted away from the Constitution, if not literally in intent, in many areas?
Yeah, there's no question. And one of the big areas that we've drifted away from the Constitution is that we've undercut states' rights. I mean, people forget about the fact that the federal government was a creation of the states, not the other way around. And in fact, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution makes it very clear that, that if it's not a responsibility that's assigned directly to the federal government, then it resides with the states and or the people.
Now, one thing I'd like to interject, Dave, so people understand it. The Constitution told us to do five things and do them well, not six, five. And they were justice, defense, state, treasury, and a collection of duties that we now call commerce. That's five things. And today we're doing 2000. And a lot of people can get cynical and say we're not doing a good job of it.
Well, let me say, encourage our viewers to take a look at the preamble of the Constitution. Read the preamble of the Constitution, which, although it wasn't voted on by the delegates, was intended to be an executive summary of what the intent of the delegates were in the creation and ratification of the Constitution. And when you look at that, you'll see that a vast majority of what the federal government is doing today is not an express and enumerated responsibility of the federal government. For example, it says provide for the common defense. All right. It says promote the general welfare. The word provide does not mean the same as the word promote. So when you end up comparing what the federal government is doing as compared to the express and enumerated responsibilities, you'll find out that a vast majority of what it's doing don't relate to those express and enumerated. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to get out of all of those businesses, all right? But there's no question the time has come to rationalize the size and scope of government, to modernize its management practices, to recognize what ought to be done at the state and local level versus the federal level, and some of the other things that we've talked about and that I elaborate on in the book.
Now, there's someone I want to bring up. He had a profound effect on my life, and particularly as the son of a Greek immigrant, which I am, was Paul Tsongas. And I want to tell you why he had an effect on me. In 1990, I went down and heard him speak in Washington, D.C. And he said the biggest, and he iterated this in an op-ed to the Washington Post a little later. He said his biggest concern for America was the feeling of dependence, was a feeling of entitlement, and he felt that was the wrong direction. Now, this is a senator from Massachusetts who's a Democrat, but he was concerned about the feeling of entitlement. And I took that, and actually, he signed a little brochure of mine, and I left. Now, some months later, he withdrew from the presidential race and tragically died a year or two later of brain cancer. But at the time, he had beaten Clinton in two primaries. And of course, he lost to one in the South, I believe, after that. But his concern was the feeling of entitlement. And then now we fast forward from 1990, 34 years. And arguably, some people tell me that we've had a populist candidate running against a very liberal populist candidate. Uh, and they're using words like Democrat and Republican when the reality of it is neither one of them are neither. So was Tsongas right? Have people changed their expectations? Do people expect more from the nation than they did maybe when you and I were growing up in the late 50s and 60s?
Well, there's a lot of issues here. First, Paul Songus and Warren Rudman, along with Pete Peterson, who I was the first CEO of his foundation, created the Concord Coalition. And I'm a supporter of the Concord Coalition, and it still exists. Secondly, there's no question that we have too many people that are looking for government to solve the problem. There's no question that we have strayed from the principles and values under which the country was founded and that made us great. And let me talk about a few of those. Limited but effective federal government, individual liberty and opportunity. That means equal opportunity, not equal result. Okay. Personal responsibility and accountability, rule of law and equal justice under the law, fiscal responsibility and intergenerational equity, and a word called stewardship. Stewardship means that as a leader, your job is not just to generate positive results today, not just to leave things better off when you leave than when you came, but better positioned for the future. And in fact, some of the words in the Constitution says for ourselves and our posterity, which means the future. And we are failing on discharging those responsibilities. So look, we need a solvent, sustainable, secure social safety net for those who are truly in need. There's no question about that. At the same point in time, the government's grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, lost control of the budget, is not managed for results. We're spending $2 trillion more a year than we're taking in, and it's projected to get worse absent a major restructuring. And can we do things to increase economic growth through a variety of actions, including regulatory relief, okay, and intelligent tax reform? Yes, but we can't grow our way out of this financial hole. We're going to have to start making tough choices on what government does, how it measures success, and we're going to have to start making tough choices on spending and revenues. There's just no way around it.
Well, if let me ask a question. If on the one hand, we become dependent on stimulus and to a degree printing money, in other words, the self-licking ice cream cone, the United States is effectively printing the money to buy its own debt or stimulus, and we become dependent on that. How do you withdraw that and protect growth so you don't have a collapse in growth at the same time? I mean, how do
Well,
you?
first, we need significant fiscal reforms. We need significant government organization operational reforms. And thirdly, we need monetary reforms. And I've said that we need several things in order to get us on the right path. Number one, we need a fiscal sustainability commission that has everything on the table, but not everything is equal, that is statutory, that learns the lessons from Simpson Bowles, that engages the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices. That's a key part, the citizen education engagement up front, that makes a package of recommendations dealing with spending and revenues and budgetary reforms that will be guaranteed an up or down vote in Congress. We need that to be able to get a jump start on doing what needs to be done. Secondly, we need a government transformation initiative to look at the size and scope of government, what it's doing, how's it doing, how does it measure success. That's more the operational side, okay? So one is really the policy side, the other is really the operational side. And the third thing we need is we need a constitutional amendment. We need a credit card limit. We need to limit how much debt as a percentage of the economy we can take on. We're too high now. We're projected to go a lot higher. We need to set a limit with extremely limited circumstances to violate it, okay? And we need to set a lower target that we want to hit in 10 to 15 years with triggers, targets, and enforcement mechanisms. That's the only way that you can bind current and future Congresses to stay on a prudent and sustainable path. The debt ceiling is a bad joke. Statutory approaches haven't stood the test of time. These are the things that we need, and we need it sooner rather than later, because recently I was asked by International Economics magazine. I'm one of just a few people they ask globally to answer the question, what percentage chance do you think there could be a global debt crisis within the next 3 to 5 years if we don't change course? And my answer was 70%. And a number of the people who I know, one of which who is a prominent economist, Steve Hanke, who's viewed as one of the top 10 economists in the world internationally, says I was lowballing it. 70%, he thought I was lowballing it. Let me just tell you this, 70 is scary enough.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because one of the purposes, and we certainly appreciate you being here today, is to inform people on these issues, because we don't think they understand clearly what the risks are and where we are as overextended as we are. You have a point at a point in your book. You state Social Security, healthcare, and interest on the debt, interest which is out of control. That's the money we have to pay every month to keep the debt, not to reduce it, just the interest payment on the debt, total 82% of the budget, I believe. I don't think it's of the money collected, which of course is a smaller number. Can you talk about that a minute and tell people how big
Well,
that,
let,
that
let me,
doesn't include
yeah,
discretionary
yeah,
spending? And
yeah. Let me give you some metrics, okay? Because the numbers can be overwhelming. In 1912, that was before the income tax, before the Federal Reserve, and before the direct election of senators, because previously senators were appointed by state legislatures to safeguard states' rights, but that changed in 1913. So in 1913, those three things that I said happened. Before those three things happened, the federal government was 2.5% of the economy. 2.5%. Now it's approaching 25% and growing. Back in before 1913 and 1912, uh, uh, 97% of annual spending by the federal government was controlled by the Congress. It was all discretionary spending. The only mandatory spending we had where we'd written a blank check was interest on the debt, 3%. That's because we couldn't manipulate interest rates and self-dealing our own debt back then. Now we've got a situation that because of those three things and a number of other things, the government has grown dramatically, lost control of the budget. We need reforms to the Federal Reserve too, because they kept interest rates too low, too long. They facilitated excessive spending and following the modern monetary theory under 2021 and 2022, which was a disaster, which should be thrown in the ash heap of history. Okay, and that resulted, that combined with buying most of the new debt, in other words, self-dealing in our debt, which is short-term gain, long-term pain, resulted in excess inflation. Now that excess inflation is coming down, but we've had inflation of over 20% in the last 3.5 years, which is hurting a lot of people. But if we don't get control of our spending, if we don't get control of our finances, it's going to get worse in the future.
that inflation could be fivefold, tenfold. Is that correct? And that just means
It could be double digits, okay? And we've been there before. You know, when the first time that I moved to Washington, D.C. area, I've lived here 3 times, a majority of my life, but I've lived in 7 states plus D.C. You know, the first time I moved here, interest rates were double digit. You know, my mortgage was double digit. And so, you know, which is obviously a major drag on the economy, and it's also a major burden on mainstream Americans.
yeah, the obligations this year are consuming, I think, if you throw in interest on the debt and the entitlements. Now that doesn't all the departments that govern the nation, that doesn't count them, including defense. I think it's almost 100% of the monies collected, not the
Well, it's
budget,
more of that. It's more
money's
of that. It's
collected.
over that. Let's talk about what the numbers are. If you just look at the spending side, okay? If you look at mandatory spending includes, you know, all the social insurance programs and a number of other things and interest. If you look at that, that's over 73% of the budget. So that means the 27% of the budget that's discretionary, which is all that Congress deals with every year. That's what, and they can't even get that right. You know, the last time they did that on time, the appropriations on time was 1996. Okay. And they didn't do it on time this year.
And they don't debate each one of them separately.
Right, right. And if you look at what's in that discretionary spending, it's all the express and enumerated responsibilities under the Constitution, okay? So what's happening is that that's getting squeezed. The number one line item in the federal budget right now is Social Security, which is a very important program, and we need to reform it to save it for the future, because if we do nothing, in 9 years, benefits get cut 21% across the board. The number two program is interest on the debt. The number three program is defense. So interest is already the number two item in the budget. It's going to be number one within the next several years if we don't change. And what do you get for interest? As we say in the South, shinola, nothing.
We're getting into a dire position in the nation, and there's no signs of it slowing down. We've become dependent on borrowing a lot of money every year, and we have this dependence, and we have to find our way out of that because the total amount borrowed now is staggering. It's estimated that $289,000 are owed by every taxpayer in America. Now we know they can't afford that kind of money. Also, every person, including babies and people that don't pay taxes, old people, owe near 90,000. And we know that money doesn't exist right now. So we have to get, I think what Dave's saying is we have to find a way out of this, and it's got to involve cutting spending. And to that point, there was a GAO report released on April 16, 2024, that estimated government fraud in spending to be between 233 billion and 521 billion. And most of that number is in entitlements and in the welfare system. And I want to throw a question out. Would it make sense to decentralize some of those things and send them back to the states? You talked about medical care as one thing, and to get decision makers closer to the sources of the claimants.
When I talk about government transformation, it's a very comprehensive concept. By that, what I mean is, what should government do? What level of government should do it, which is devolution, which is what you're talking about, okay? How should it measure success? How should it be organized? How should it link resources to results? I mean, it's a very comprehensive concept. 12 years ago, I called for a government transformation initiative because I saw where we were headed. There's a good chance we may get one during the new administration, because the President-elect Trump and Elon Musk are talking about a government efficiency commission. In my view, that's a subset of what needs to be done. We need economy, efficiency, effectiveness. We need to consider, devolution as one of the things. We need to consider consolidation. We need to consider elimination. And fortunately, I have a lot of experience in this, in my various roles in the past, in particular as Comptroller General of the United States, which in English is Auditor General and Chief Performance and Accountability Officer de facto for the United States, because we engaged in a major transformation ourselves. And what we did was highly successful, was acclaimed by independent parties, and it's transferable and scalable to the rest of government. But to get it done, you've got to have support from the very top, which means the President of the United States. And you've got to have people who are committed to it and have relevant experience to be able to make it a reality.
You
Oh,
know,
by the way, Tony,
I think back, go ahead.
by the way, there are a lot of things that are transferable from the private sector to the public sector, but the government is not a business. It needs to adopt more business practices, but it doesn't have the same metrics as a business. The degree of difficulty in making transformational change in government is multiple times greater than it is in the private sector. I've run organizations in all three sectors of the economy, because you have a bigger cultural problem, a much bigger cultural problem. You have a lot more constraints from a legal standpoint, if you will, and you have a lot more transparency. So how you go about it makes a tremendous difference, especially for government transformation, and it's the difference between success and failure.
Now, let me just interject this and get your thoughts on it. There are three economists that come to mind that spoke about bureaucracy in general, and uh, one was Schumpeter, and that was back in the 50s, 1950s, and then Shoemaker wrote "Small is Beautiful," and more recently Mansur Olson, who wrote The Rise and Decline of Nations. And Mansur was actually an economist, right? Started out at Maryland and went to Princeton, but they're all deceased. But Mansur, for one, said the only way you get rid of an entrenched bureaucracy basically is to nuke it or carpet bomb it, that it doesn't go away. In other words, the whole social structure can melt all around it, and the bureaucracy will still be there. Now, that was Mansur Olson, but Schumpeter made points that the best efficiencies are achieved if the decision makers are close to the parties, if there's not geographic differences. In other words, it's not just getting bureaucrats with IQs of 150 to sit in an office in Washington and determine what's best for different people in different places under different conditions. And so does that present an issue? The fact that this bureaucracy in Washington, according to these three academics who were not socialists, they were all free market economists, uh, really had a problem with that entrenched bureaucracy. What are your thoughts?
I- I've had the pleasure and the honor of running three federal agencies, two in the executive branch and one in the legislative branch. Uh, and one of the things that I've found over the years that many of the organizational structures, footprints, human capital, and other practices that the federal government uses uh, are based upon conditions that existed in the United States in the 1950s. It has not been modernized. It needs to be modernized. I'll give you two examples. One example is what we did at GAO when I was Comptroller General. We did our first ever strategic plan. We dramatically transformed the agency based upon that strategic plan. We eliminated a third of our offices footprint. We eliminated a layer of management. We reduced the number of organizational units from 35 to 13. We focused more horizontally and externally rather than internally. We changed our metrics for success, both organizationally and individually. We modernized our technology and our human capital practices. We made dramatic and fundamental changes. And so we were smaller, but we were more productive. We generated a much higher return on investment. Over $100 for every dollar invested in the agency is what we return back to the government. What we did there is transferable and scalable to other parts of government. Now, there are challenges associated with that because GAO is thousands of people rather than millions of people, okay, but they are transferable. I'll give you the second example. The second example is the Defense Department. I'm on the Defense Business Board, okay, and have been for many years in different administrations, okay. Um, you know, if you look at the composition of the Defense Department, there's two components that people talk about. The tooth, which is warfighting capability, and the tail, which is overhead and support. Both are important, okay? But the tail has grown dramatically faster than the tooth. That's the so-called bureaucracy. And one of the things that's going to have to be done is that we're going to have to cut the tail to sharpen the teeth. We're going to have to, and one of the things that we may need is something that I refer to as a bureaucracy brack. We've talked about having, approaches that rationalize bases, the number of bases we have. We need to employ that concept to be able to rationalize the size and scope of government and to reduce the amount of overhead that we have in government and to leverage more modern technology and travel capabilities and everything else. Uh, uh, because as Reagan said, the only thing that is close to perpetual life is a federal government program or unit or activity, if you will.
I think civil defense still exists.
Yeah, well, it may not be so civil though, but that's a different issue.
Yeah, it's really challenging. It's a little scary to hear that. It's going to scare a lot of people to hear it that there may be dramatic cuts in government, but
And you don't do it all at once. I mean, some things you have to do it, you have to phase it in over time, right? And, you know, in some cases you use early outs and things of that nature to try to get people to transition quicker than otherwise they might transition. But you know, our current path, position and path is unsustainable. Do we want more growth? Absolutely. And there's a number of things that we can do to generate more growth. But the new four-letter word in fiscal policy is math. The math doesn't come close to working. You cannot grow your way out of this problem. You have to make tough choices with regard to the size and scope of government, what level of government's doing what, how do you measure success on the revenue side and on the spending side. The spending side is the bigger problem, but we're going to have more revenues. And you can get more revenues through you know, comprehensive tax reform because you know our system is overly complex. It's difficult for the IRS to be able to administer it. They're outgunned. They'll always be outgunned. And there are real opportunities for us to be able to streamline and simplify that system in ways that will generate more growth and get more people paying something with the wealthy paying more than they are right now. But in a more equitable and sustainable fashion.
well, as you know, I'm working on that and using a military principle, KISS, keep it simple, stupid,
Right.
and broaden the base and lower the rate.
Well,
And
that's right, and that's in the book. I mean, one of the things that's in the book is I had a hypothesis in 2012, and that was that the American people were a lot smarter than the politicians realized, that they understood that we couldn't continue to spend more money than we make, charge with a credit card without a day of reckoning. They were willing to accept tough choices as long as they're part of a comprehensive goal-based plan consistent with principles and values that brought people together rather than divide them apart. And we went on a 10,000 mile, 27 state national fiscal responsibility bus tour that was highly successful and resulted in 77 to 97% agreement on specific reforms in a whole range of areas, such as budget controls and reforms, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare, defense, government organization operations, taxes, and political reforms. That's what we need to do again, but this time what needs to happen is it needs to be part of a statutory commission that the president and the Congress buy into that will get the media attention, that will provide the needed resources, and that will set the table for a tough vote, up or down vote in Congress.
that has to happen soon, I would say.
Yes.
I haven't sent it to you yet, but in my code, my hope is just to recapture some of the opportunity costs. Opportunity costs are when you go and you practice avoidance, which is what many Americans do. It's part of human nature to avoid to pay. It's not evasion. You have such a complex code that a whole group of lawyers and accountants thrive, make livings off of mapping out ways to avoid taxes. And if you err on the side of simplicity, you eliminate that. Then people won't be making choices with their money based on avoiding a tax. They'll
Well, for full disclosure, I am a certified public accountant, and I
yeah,
recognize that there's a lot of CPAs and lawyers that make money on this. That's not good for the economy. It's not good for the country. You know, what the American people supported through that tour that I just talked to you about, which is talked about in the book, is dramatically streamline and simplify the tax code, keep rates as low as possible, and to look at our tax system to make sure that we are employing the principles I talked about before, incentives, transparency, and accountability, because in some cases we're incenting things that are a problem. For example, one of the top three tax preferences in the Internal Revenue Code is that people don't pay income tax or payroll tax on employer provided and paid health care, which fuels healthcare costs, which disassociates transparency between what you're getting and what you're paying. So on one hand, we're trying to control healthcare costs. On the other hand, our tax policy encourages the exact opposite, which is mindless.
Avoidance fees might total up to 800 billion a year, and maybe they should only be 50 billion a year. We can recapture that money. Opportunity costs, very hard to measure. They could be a half a trillion to a trillion, and we should be able to recapture 70, 80% of that with just simplicity and not having the tax code cause you to change your behavior. And those are things that are needed, and certainly I'm mindful of them, and I'm very anxious to have you review my work when I get it to you in a week or so. So all these things need to be done, and they're based on basically two elemental things to our system, which are under strain: hope and opportunity. And it's almost like the chicken and the egg. I mean, if you don't have opportunities, it's hard to keep your hope. Uh, but being the son of an immigrant father who survived the Christian Holocaust in Turkey, made it to America, and was always positive and always sought solutions. People have to keep positive going forward because there are going to be difficulties. It's not going to be an easy path, I don't feel. What do you feel about hope and opportunity and how it might have been affected and changed? I feel like a lot of money has been shifted to the upper 10, 15% in the last 20 years, and the middle class has been sort of left high and dry.
We are at a point where the gap between the haves and the have-nots is great, where the middle class is being squeezed. Take the tax side, over 40% of taxpayers pay zero income tax. They pay payroll taxes, but they pay zero income tax. About 20% of individual tax filers not only don't pay any income tax, they get money back through the earned income tax credit, child care tax credits that are refundable tax credits. Um, the wealthy pay a very large percentage of our income taxes. But one of the things that we have to do is that we have to get more people paying something and the wealthy paying more. But we need to do that through a dramatic simplification of our tax system and modernization of our tax system. As we look to the future, in the most recent election, over 70% of Americans felt that we were on the wrong path.
We're
Over,
here today, people, with the Honorable David Walker. We're talking about the future of America and what has to be done. We're talking with possibly one man who's the most versed in that particular area, the monetary area and spending. He's got a book, American 2040. It's on Amazon. It's on his own website, which is, can you tell him the website again, Dave?
American2040.com.
And everybody should look at it. These things are coming up to bite us in the short term, I might say, and people need to be informed so we don't have the divisiveness we have today. I'll also add Dave is one of the leaders in No Labels, which is a political group, but it's a political group that's maintained a distance from the so-called Democrats and so-called Republicans today. I'm on them, listening in on many of their podcasts. They're very informative. The opinions are just broad opinions on a number of topics. They and I want to say they ought to be noted in this conversation. Uh, what we're getting at a point where we're going to get near closing remarks, and I wanted to throw something out because I do know that you worked under Paul Volcker, and I understand he called you something. But can you tell us a little bit about first your experiences with Paul Volcker and what you might have learned from him?
Well, Paul Volcker was one of the advisors to my Come Back America initiative that I created after I ran the Peterson Foundation. And I had interaction with him on and off over the years. Paul Volcker was also featured in the award-winning documentary IOUSA, which came out in 2007, of which I was prominently featured in. And in that documentary, he called me the Paul Revere of fiscal responsibility, which I was humbled by and appreciative of. And I can honestly say there's nobody been on this case for as long as I have. It's about 30 years since I was a trustee of Social Security and Medicare, and I've been in different positions in the battlefield, but I'm still fighting. The other thing is that Paul Volcker, as you may recall, ended up heading the Oil for Food investigation regarding the UN. And after he did that, one of the things they did is they recommended the creation of an independent audit advisory committee. And Paul recruited me along with the State Department to be the first chairman of that. So I did that for about 5 years for the United Nations, if you will. So, he was a great man. He was a big man in more ways than one, okay, including stature. But there aren't any Paul Volckers anymore.
No.
I mean, at
But
the
you say
beginning,
what you mean. What do you mean by that, Dave? What
the
type of
people
man?
the people that have the credibility, the backbone, to be able to do what's right, even though it may not be popular. We have too many people today, and there are exceptions, okay? There are exceptions, Tony, but not enough. We have too many people today that are focusing on today. They're too narrowly focused, and they're focusing on what it means to them rather than what it means to our country and what it means to the future, including of our families. And it comes back to what I said before. As a leader, you can't just focus on today. You have to figure out what needs to be done to help create a better tomorrow. And we don't have enough of them today. Um, and Paul Volcker was clearly one of them. Another one, frankly, we've talked about several. Another which we haven't talked about is Ross Perot. Ross Perot was that way. And Ross, in fact, was provided most, but not all, of the funding for that tour that I talked about in 2012. I mean, because he was very concerned about our future, as he should have been, and as we all should be.
Well, he gave Bill Clinton the presidency. You know,
Well, yeah, there are debates about that, okay, but the bottom line is Clinton did win. But I will also tell you that Bill Clinton was the last president who was fiscally responsible. When I came in as Comptroller General of the United States, we had surpluses for 4 years in a row. We paid down debt 2 of those 4 years. In 2001, CBO was projecting that we were going to pay off all the national debt, which I didn't believe for a nanosecond. In 2003, which I talk about in the book, three things happened that convinced me that things were out of control, and it's gotten a lot worse since then.
oh, it's gotten a lot worse. And I will say, because I really don't really agree with you that he was responsible for it. I think it was the internet, the adoption of the internet started not in his first 2 years. His first 2 years were actually pretty bad in and it was in '94 when Newt got in there, but I don't think he was responsible either. I think the non-farm labor productivity shot through the roof for the highest numbers in our lifetime, for annual numbers, not just quarter numbers, of over 3% from '94 up through 2000. And that labor productivity was a driver, the quiet driver, just like the labor productivity in President Trump's 4 years was 1.78 if you don't count 2020, when the century average was one, the long-term average was 1.5, going back to
Well, there's no question, Tony, that President Clinton benefited from the internet boom, the so-called the dot-com boom, if you will, some of which became a dot bust. But on the other hand, he did work on a bipartisan basis with Newt Gingrich. He did talk about the era of big government is over. He did end up engaging in welfare reform, and so he did do some things. I'm just talking about the numbers. When you look at the numbers, he's the last one that was fiscally responsible. We haven't had one since, no matter what the party is. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that President-elect Trump will end up doing some of the things that we've talked about earlier in this, because that is what the country needs, and it would be a great legacy for him.
Well, my hope is the same, but a little bit different. I hope that people will begin to understand what needs to be done, because it can be perceived as a very difficult period coming up, and will be unless people fully understand it. And it's going to be a difficult period. And I think uh, in order to return hope and opportunity for regular Americans, for our grandchildren, for the next generation, it has to be done, because the other path is just utter failure when the currency fails.
If you love your country, if you love your children, if you love your grandchildren, you will recognize the reality that we've got to start making tough choices sooner rather than later, and that things like the BRICS are need to be taken very, very seriously, which we're not taking it seriously enough right now. America is a great country, arguably the greatest of all time, but we're not as great as we think we are. And we've got a lot of red lights flashing that we need to address sooner rather than later.
And this might be a good way to bring this to the end. We're with the Honorable David Walker. We're recommending his book, America in 2040. And we thank you so much for taking time out of your busy life to deliver this message. I hope that when people see it, they don't consider two old guys who already have made enough money to live out their lives, offering up a plan that's going to just squeeze everybody. But to a degree, it's going to take sacrifice. And in order for us to stay together, we don't want to start fighting each other. It will never happen. And we'll do ourselves in quicker than the BRICS ever could. But otherwise, uh, thank you so much for being on, David, and bless you. And all of our viewers have a blessed week. Sunshine and transparency. We're seeking the truth, and we appreciate people like David Walker for coming on and helping us with it. And thank
Thank,
you so much.
thank you, Tony. May God be with you. May God be with our viewers. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye bye.